The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 19, and we'll be looking there in just a moment, Deuteronomy 19. We'll be concluding the series of lessons on the subject of justice this evening, though I have plans to preach on some other topics that I think overlap and address some of the sort of overlapping language and concerns that go along with some of the things that we've been talking about in these lessons. This morning, we were talking about procedures. You know, what is the process that we go to get at justice? When you're talking about justice, by and large, what you're talking about is questions of right and wrong, and generally a question of someone who is making an accusation and someone whom the accusation is being made against. And there's an inherent sense of somebody is saying there is guilt and then someone is denying guilt. There's not really a question if somebody's saying someone's guilty and then the person admits it, right? We know how to get to the truth there. The question is, what about denials? What about when there's differences? How do we arrive at who is right and who is wrong? And we talked about some of those limitations, some of the rules I think God puts in place. And what I want to talk about this evening is some of the damage that gets done when we don't follow those rules, and ways in which I think we need to think about practicing those rules maybe in smaller arenas than the world at large. Well, to begin with, I want to talk about gossip and false witnesses. I think the idea of false witnesses is a key element of justice that gets very little play in most of the conversations that are had on the subject. But the idea of false witness is taken very seriously all through scriptures. It is one of the 10 commandments. Do not bear false witness. God goes so far as to lay out the punishment, and in fact, as we look to old laws, sometimes we wonder about the appropriateness of those laws in a modern context. I'll come back to that concept later. But here, I think we could all see the value, the benefit of a law like this. In Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 18 beginning, Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 18, where we left off reading this morning, the judges shall investigate thoroughly, and if the witness is a false witness, and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. The rest will hear and be afraid, and will never do such an evil thing among you. Thus you shall not show pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. False witness is a national pastime. It is engaged and participated with flippancy. The false witness is put forward on page 1, and if it is corrected in a subparagraph on page 16. There's just very little accountability when it comes to false witness. And on social media, there's no accountability. You just are allowed to say whatever you like and as far and wide as you like. And there is no question of evidence. And when somebody challenges, generally, there's not even a backing off. It's not even that there is a corrective. And very often people will say things in addressing their false witness. Well, that particular thing may not be true, but generally speaking, basically, the consequences of what I'm saying are still true. This person's still a bad person. So even if I got the quote wrong, even if I got the circumstances wrong, the events wrong, doesn't matter because he's still bad. Okay, so you just justified your own false witness. God says the thing that you want to happen to that person for the thing that you said that he did, that ought to be what happens to you. And in fact, I think that's what we see laid out in judge not that you be not judged. Whatever you're doling out, that's coming back at you. And so he puts some very serious language attached to false witness. I think sometimes false witnesses have wicked motives, as in the case of Jesus in Matthew chapter 26. And beginning in verse 59, we see that the high priest, the chief priests, they're going out, they're looking for false witnesses. And the implication is they're willing to pay. And they have a hard time finding them, but eventually they find some who are willing to come forward and present false testimony against Jesus. Well, there's no doubt about what their motives are, right? We don't see people who are, maybe likable rubes who just don't know better. Sometimes, though, I do think that the motives are not so sinister. In fact, I think most, or at least much, of the false witness and gossip that is participated in among most people is not with bad motives. I think very often it's just too much time on our hands. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and in verse 11, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 11, a couple pages over here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 11, it says, "For we hear that there are some among you leading an undisciplined life, doing no work at all, but acting like busybodies." And so here are people who are going about and they're causing problems. They're making life harder among the brethren. And why? What's at the heart of it? Lack of discipline, lack of employment. They need a life. I think about that. When I see all the engagement and the participation in false witness, the spreading of lies on social media, and I think, what would solve this? Maybe it's just get a life. How do you know so much about what's going on? And in fact, they don't very often know so much, but they've read a blog and they're going to pass it along. And they're going to pass it along like fact. Now, I think sometimes what we do is we don't pass it along and say this is fact, but maybe we try to hide what is actually gossip and what is actually the spread of false witness by saying, now, I don't know if this is true. Well, let's just stop right there. Don't hit send, right? Because if it's not, then what you have done is you've just come alongside someone who said something that is not true. And then what you've done is you've just aided them in getting that untruth, a wider audience than it otherwise would have had. And you say, look, I just want people to think about things. I do too. That's why I'm not going to spread false information. That doesn't help people think about things. In Proverbs chapter 10 and in verse 18, "He who conceals hatred has lying lips, and he who spreads slander is a fool." When you are one who spreads, when you take it from here and then you take it farther, you become a fool, you become a participant in the injustice. Now you may say, well, I didn't know it was slander. I'm not saying you have to know that. You can be a fool without intentionally being a fool. You can be an unknowing participant. But if you don't know, if you're not certain of the testimony, why then we need to dial back our contributions along those lines. Exodus chapter 23. In Exodus chapter 23 and verse 1, "You shall not bear a false report." I like this language. "Do not join your hand with a wicked man to be a malicious witness." Now maybe he's the one that's malicious. Maybe you're not so malicious. You just kind of bought it. He's the malicious witness. But now you joined your hand with him and said, let me help you in your malice to spread that around. Now, how does that work? Well, we see something that happens that's public. We don't know all the details. And instead of waiting for the details to come out, or better yet, moving on with our lives because this is something that doesn't have to do with what I'm about, we engage and we try to get to the bottom of it. Let me just suggest to you, if you're having to Google for your details, you will not get to the bottom of it. You will get to the bottom of something, but it will not be it. And so you'll go and you'll examine and you'll gather all sorts of perspectives from people who also don't know. And then you'll think you're an expert. But what you really are is just a gossip and a false witness. And somebody might say, and I've even had this conversation with people when they share things on social media, and they say, well, how can you know the truth? And I'll say, let me let you in on a little secret. Sometimes you can't. Well, then how am I supposed to form an opinion on this? Guess what? You don't have to. You can be unopinionated on it. Oh, that's not possible. We got to have an opinion, don't we? And I not only have to have an opinion, I need to share that opinion. No, you don't. That's really what is at the heart of gossip. Is me thinking I have reason to find out information that I really don't need to know. Not only to find it out, but also to spread it. And boy, we love to be the source of information. And it's that desire to share and to be looked at as authoritative that so often gets us into trouble, so often causes us to join hands with someone who is spreading lies, who is spreading gossip. I think Proverbs chapter 18 that we've looked at, Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 17, I think we can, not meaning to, actually participate in causing the problem that's sort of laid out in Proverbs 18. Proverbs 18 verse 17, the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. When something publicly notorious occurs, and information is out there to some degree, but certainly not to a full degree. And so we see some details of an event, a crime that's committed, some political scandal that has occurred. And we don't know all the details, but we think we do. And because we're either for the victim or we are on the side of the accused, we go ahead and take sides. And whatever details that come out that support what we want to end up with, that's the ones we share. And we really don't want to hear what the other side has to say about that. Sometimes, even when there's video evidence that comes out, that doesn't mean you know all the details. I was talking to a friend a while back about public event and among many that were being discussed, and he used to be a police officer, and I asked him about one particular, what do you think about this? What's your take on this? He said, well, my first take is that I don't know what all happened there. That's what I'm certain of. It's a fair point. He said, my second take is that from my perspective, just from what I do know, this is what I as a police officer would have done differently, and this is what I think he may be in trouble for. But more information may come out that changes my mind on that. And he said, I think the biggest problem is going to be, and this is where it got interesting, the biggest problem is going to be the more people who publicly speculate, it's going to put pressure on people to bring charges that are not warranted by the evidence. And what's going to happen is they're going to go after this guy for something that he actually isn't guilty of, and the public pressure is going to lead to one of two conclusions. He's going to end up being put in jail for something he's not actually guilty of, or because public pressure calls them to over pursue, he's going to get off scot-free, and that won't be just either. And when you get on social media and you join in with the crowd calling for freedom of the accused or for persecution of the accused, you're part of the injustice that results. Stay out of it. Gossip, false witness, never helps us actually get to a point of justice. And so I hear people say, Christians, we need to stand up and be heard. We do, but not on things we don't know about. On that, we need to shut our mouths. And there needs to just be a whole lot more of shutting our mouths about things we don't know about. The court of public opinion is rarely just. Almost never. I think of Acts chapter 19, such an appropriate description of mob justice. Acts chapter 19 and verse 32. So then, some were shouting one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. No kidding. I saw some footage from a riot / protest in Berkeley, 50 years ago, 60s or 70s, somewhere around in there. And the reporter came up to one of the protesters and says, "What are you here for?" And he goes, "We're here to bring down the man." And they said, "Well, what has the man done?" "We're not sure, but we're here to bring him down." And I thought of this. And I think that so often that's what that looks like. Everybody gets worked up into a frenzy. What are you angry about? I don't know, but we're sure it's wrong. And you start looking for details and you start looking for specifics. What exactly has happened here? And what exactly would you like to be done about that? Conversation's over. You want to talk about details? You want to talk about facts? What's your problem? Don't you understand that there's unrest here? Yeah, I do. I want to know what's causing it. I think we've been trained to think that democracy is the ultimate good. That total and true democracy would be the best way to be led. Let me just tell you, there is no tyranny like true democracy. We don't live in a true democracy, and I want to tell you, we don't want to live in a true democracy. Have you looked at America's top 40 music? You want the same process that chooses the top 10 songs in our country to be choosing the laws that we adhere to? We do not want to be run by the masses. And so we don't put it to an American Idol vote as to whether people are guilty or innocent. We have a very particular process that we're supposed to go to. Is that perfect? No. But the mob mentality is worse. And I think when God points in Romans 13 to government, to a tyrannical government, that's one of the things he's telling us. True democracy really is anarchy. And it's worse. It's much worse than having an inefficient and sometimes unfair government. And so we don't want the court of public opinion. We don't want to know who's guilty based on likes and comments and who's getting the most activity on social media. In fact, very often the only people with good sense are the ones not commenting on there. And so it is no good indicator as to what reality is. I think one thing that happens too along those lines is that people express those opinions, they participate in that gossip, and then if they end up being correct, they think they have been vindicated, and they have not. I had a friend who was accused of sexually molesting a middle school student at the school where he was a teacher back in 2006. I was horrified. He was a preacher of the gospel as well as a school teacher. And when those charges came out and he was put on leave while they investigated, I went to his house and I saw him. And he explained the situation as he saw it and understood it. And I believed him. I believed his testimony because everything I knew about him suggested that that would be true. I got to church the following Sunday, and one of the ladies said, "Have you heard about this fellow?" And I said, "I have." And she said, "Well, I know he's guilty." I said, "Really?" "I do not." "How do you know he's guilty?" And she said, "Well, I heard." And she went on to tell me what all she had heard. And among the things she had heard was that Prosecutors don't go about charging people unless they have good evidence. Okay. You and I don't watch the same news, but okay. And I said, well, do you know him? She said, well, I know who he is. I said, well, I do know him. And for right now, I'm going to put my trust in him. And at the very least, I'm going to give him the presumption of innocence. 6 months went by. He pled guilty. He still told me at that time that he pled guilty because they said they were going to railroad him if he didn't. Later, I found out that the evidence was substantial, that he absolutely was guilty. I heard that from his own children who are friends of mine. That woman at the end of all that said, well, I guess I was right. I said, no, you weren't. You still didn't know. You still had no business going around saying someone was guilty when you had no evidence. It doesn't make gossip okay just because your gossip turns out to be true. And people spew their grievances on Facebook. And without any investigation, we just pick that up and we say, here, let me share that grievance with everybody else. Because I want to give a voice to this person. Well, there's a place for that voice. And that ain't it. And so we need to practice restraint that social media, that our current internet usage is not teaching us, but God's word is. You hold back, you don't comment, you don't become a part of the mob, even when the mob has it right. I think as far as doing justice, this is a term that's picked up now, biblical term, picked up. We need to do justice. Absolutely, we do. What does that look like? Well, the question I think that needs to be asked is, are you practicing justice in your very small jurisdiction? And your jurisdiction is small. I don't know of anybody here who has a seat on the Supreme Court, or even, in fact, any court. And so your jurisdiction is going to be pretty small, where you're required to make judgments, where you're required to participate. So where are you practicing? How are you practicing justice? Luke chapter 16 and verse 10 talks about those who are faithful in small things. And here are people who are constantly asking the question in terms of social justice, are you being just in terms of the whole world? And very often what's happening is at the very moment that they're asking that question about whether or not you're being just to the whole world, that in large measure, very high percentage of the time, there's some injustice being practiced towards people that they actually know. They're making accusations without evidence. They're making broad sweeping statements about people who have actual identities. I've seen people who give stories about something that's happened to them, and then one thing that they seem to forget is that there were other people there. I read one such story on the internet as we were going through some of the more heated moments over the last year. I read a story and I thought, now, wait a minute. I know people who would have been there, and I called some of those people. And they said, no. That's not the way I remember that at all. I was at a lecture several years ago where a man gave a speech about grace, a lecture about grace. And one of the things he said is, growing up, I never heard sermons about grace. And then it got really awkward because there was a question and answer session, and that guy's preacher, when he was growing up, was in the audience. And he said, I think I'm the one that you heard growing up. Do you mean I didn't preach any sermons on grace? He's like, well, no. I didn't mean you. I'm like, well, you just made a claim. You heard no sermons about grace. Here's a guy who was preaching when you were growing up, and you just said you didn't mean him. Something's not adding up here. And I've seen this happen over and over. the churches of Christ that I grew up in are this. And then I'll see somebody who was actually in that church make a comment. Are you referring to me? Oh, no, not you. You see, when you put a face to it, when it's actual conversation, then these broad sweeping accusations just sort of fizzle away very often. That's justice right here. And I think the desire to figure out how to be just across the planet has made it very difficult for people to figure out how to be just right here. Because they get caught up in those sort of worldwide justice campaigns and forget that those campaigns involve actual people being accused, who have actual testimony to bring to the table. I know somebody made an accusation pretty broadly. And one of the things I noted about that accusation is, if it were true, then that would make Tom Holly indicted by your accusation. That's one of the questions I asked. Do you think he falls into the category of bad people that you just described? Well, now look, I'm not saying that. You're not meaning to say that, but you are. And so we got to be more careful and more thoughtful about our communications, and maybe dial it back in to a smaller circle and make sure that our communications with one another are what they ought to be. People talking about how we ought to be gracious to the whole world, but they can't be gracious right here to the people who are their own family. We need to ask the questions about who we're willing to pervert justice for or against. In Exodus chapter 23, Travis read for us this morning. Exodus chapter 23 and verse 3. Nor, he says, shall you be partial to a poor man in his dispute. In verse 8. Nor shall you take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just. Two reasons why you might pervert justice that are presented here. One is greed. Influence, power, right? And so you show deference to the person who gives you money. On the other side, you might show deference out of sympathy. And he says neither one's okay. And so you got to be honest with yourself and think, would I pervert justice for or against someone? I'll pervert justice for this poor person because I'm sympathetic to them. I'll pervert justice against this poor person because they can't do anything in response. I think some people would excuse at least one of those. But God doesn't excuse either one of those. He said justice is a sameness about how we treat people. And it does not make excuses and give some sort of allowance for breaking the rules of justice in this particular case, because after all, fill in the blank however you want to there. Justice has no partiality for any reason. Do you receive accusations that you should not? Again, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 19, it's explicit. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except by 2 or 3 witnesses. Sometimes I don't even think we require one witness. I heard from a friend who heard from a friend's good enough. And I'll take that accusation and I'll run with it. And I'll convict judge, jury, executioner. When a moment's hesitation would have saved us so much turmoil. There's an imperative not just to not participate from the standpoint of spreading, but also, he says, do not receive. That's the thing about false accusations. They don't get very far if they don't have a reception. And so don't be the one who listens. Wes Brown tells a story about an older preacher who was a mentor to him. I love this story. He said some brothers, young men, came to him And in their youthful zeal, they were ready to convict an older brother there in the congregation. And they said, they gave their grievances to this fella. And they said, what are you going to do about it? And he said, well, I'm going to go get my keys. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, we're going to go over and see him. And they were, whoa. You see, what he did is he wasn't willing to just receive false accusations. If we're going to have accusations, let's play it out. Let's bring that to where it ought to go. Let's investigate. Let's find out. Let's get to the bottom of this. Let's see if we can find some reconciliation. Reconciliation is unfortunately not the goal of most modern social justice. Perpetual grievance is on the table. And that's not what God is looking for. Another question, and you're practicing of personal justice, doing justice in your life, is are you able to reconcile the concepts of justice and mercy? There is irony as you look around at people who would cry out against actual justice in some instances, and at the same time would be the same ones that would turn around. They would say, in this case, there's no mercy. But then there are certain crimes, and by crimes, I mean disagreements from which you are not allowed to recover. Not ever, no matter what you say. You're done. And I would say that's across the board. I mentioned my friend who was convicted of sexually molesting a junior high student. He's a registered sex offender now. That label will never leave him. And I'm not saying that that's unfair. And in fact, I think I understand. I understand what's going on. I understand why that is. In fact, he became a repeat offender like many do. Last I heard, he's back in jail. But to brand people that way in this one instance and then virtually nowhere else, it's a strange thing for our culture. And one of the reasons that people do that is they say, here's the sort of crime that people don't change after committing. You do this, there is no changing. I'll tell you, God's calculus is that there is no crime like that. Every crime can be recovered from. Even the sex offender, even the pedophile. The gospel can change anyone. Now, there's consequences that go along with sin. I know of a registered sex offender who was a part of a congregation. He came in very clearly making people as aware as they wanted to be of what his crimes were. He said, I know that may make some of you uncomfortable. I know that you may worry about me being around your children, and I'm understanding of that. What can I do to make you comfortable? They communicated. They came up with some parameters, some boundaries for him, and he happily abides by those. And he is a welcome and received member of that congregation. Not a Bible class teacher in the kids' class. But he is a loved and appreciated member of that congregation. But the world says, you got to be done with folks like that. Not the gospel. Much less crimes that aren't even crimes. And so here, in our pursuit of justice, righteous justice, we need to be so careful to recognize the balance and the appropriate balance between that and mercy. As James chapter 2 and verse 13 says, judgment will be merciless to the one who has shown no mercy, but mercy triumphs over justice. Well, finally, what about equality. Somebody who is on board with the social justice narrative may be wondering at a series of lessons on justice that does not address the question of equality. Because really, that's at the core. That's at the core of the message of social justice. That's the way they define justice. You can measure it. Has justice been done? Well, let's see. Are there people who are unequal? Then justice has not been done. And that's not God's calculus, but it is the world's calculus. So why haven't I addressed it in those kinds of terms? Well, because I think terms like economic justice, if I bring that to the Scriptures, of course that verbiage is not in the Scriptures, but when God goes about talking about economic justice, he talks about it in terms of treating fairly. In Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 36, Leviticus 19 and verse 36, you shall have just balances, just weights, a just ephah, and a just hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you from the land of Egypt. Now I think very often the poor get brought into that. The outcast, the stranger gets brought into that. And often he's brought into it from the perspective of they are most likely to be the victims of this very sort of abuse. But guess what? You got to have those just weights and balances no matter who your customer is. God just might say, that guy over there can afford your dishonesty even less. But what is he calling for in the end? Honesty. He's not calling for redistribution of wealth. He's calling for you to be fair in your interactions with these people. You pay that worker, especially the poor man, pay him what you owe him and when you owe him. He needs that money. But what are you paying? You pay him what he's worked for, what he is owed. That's the question of justice, and that's the question of economic justice. Social justice warrior comes in and he says, it is not just until everybody has the same outcome. God doesn't go there. He doesn't press for same outcomes. He presses for equal treatment under the law. What's happening here very often is the concepts of charity and justice are being overlapped and confused with one another. In Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 17, Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 17, it says there, for the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who does not show partiality nor take a bribe. He executes justice for the orphan and the widow and shows his love for the alien by giving him food and clothing. Now, I know some theologians who would take that and say, see, justice is the giving of food and clothing. It is not. That's charity. And a just man ought to be charitable. God demands that he be charitable. But it is not the same thing as justice. And that's so much of the problem with the conversation is when you have a poor man over here and he is needy, then the call is not for charity but for justice. And as soon as that poor man believes that being given stuff and being charitable and receiving grace is justice, man, I'm going to tell you what, like our conversation about grace last week, if he doesn't see that as grace, that's a real problem. And it's a problem for him and it's a problem for both sides. And so what's being described here is two characteristics of God. That he is just and he is fair and he is also kind. And we want both things, but they are not the same thing. And so we need to practice justice. And in fact, people who conflate those very often end up committing injustice in the name of charity. And they say, I want to be charitable to this guy with your money. And that's no charity at all. And so we need to discern. We need to be able to distinguish between concepts, even when they're being talked about close together. And understand what What action goes with what description, with what word? We're not left without direction. The idea of social justice, Friedrich Hayek says, the idea of social justice is that the state should treat different people unequally in order to make them equal. That the state should look out and it should say to one group of people, what it should do is it should pursue making people equal instead of treating them equally. God counsels the latter, not the former. You will never accomplish the former. You can always accomplish the latter. You can always treat people equally. You can always give equal respect to everyone you meet, everyone you come in contact with, but you will never accomplish making sure everyone is equal in the end. But what you can do is cause a big mess in trying. And there's ample evidence to show that. I tell you, the worst thing is as we investigate social justice and its origins and connections, that here are people writing on this subject who hate God. You take some of the modern purveyors of social justice and critical race theory. I find Christians reading and recommending resources like Ibram Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Robin DiAngelo. If you've not heard these names, be thankful. But if you're going to college, you will hear these names. And you'll be stunned, and you'll think, what on earth is happening? What am I reading here? Here's when a Christian receives that. What they're doing is they're going and they're finding somebody who would say about large and vast swaths of what is written in this book, God's instruction to men, they would say this is part of injustice. That what God says about men and women, unjust. What God says about homosexuality, unjust. What God says about slavery, unjust. And we go to those people and say, teach me about justice? No. You don't even know who the source of it is. You can't teach me about a concept that you have totally upside down because you reject the very tenets, the very foundations on which to build concepts of justice. Now, I'm perfectly willing to read those people. I have read those people. I'm always willing to listen to what false teachers have to say. In fact, I'm very interested to see what they have to say. What I'm not doing is soaking it in. And I think that especially our young people, we have to be careful about what's being soaked in. So much propaganda, so much misinformation, so much presenting of a few facts and then trying to lead people to the place that they want to go. And all it is turning. I was talking to Wes Brown about this months and months ago. He said, there's a group of people out there trying to convince me that treating everybody the same is the problem. And they think I'm the crazy person. And I'll just not have it. And I have no room for it. And so I'm just going to keep presenting what God's Word has to say. And it won't be popular. And we won't be well respected. And I also want to say, I have no quarter for this. A fellow asked a question the other day. He said, I think we've been so scared of these theories, and we've just failed to ask, what are they getting right? And that's fair. I understand. I understand that at some level, I want to know what the atheist gets right. But all along, I want to understand that at his very core, he's the fool that says there is no God. And so I think we got to be careful in our attempts to try to cultivate relationships and try to figure out where we're on the same ground, that we don't make up common ground, that we don't imagine common ground where it's not actually there. The world is full of unjust judges, and they're asking us to get on board. The world has always found groups of people willing to railroad other groups of people. The names are changing. In fact, I think about somebody that says, I used to be so judgmental. I've heard that all my life. I've even felt that way sometimes. People say that. I used to be so judgmental. And what I found very frequently is people who say that, they still are. They just change the targets. They just started taking the world's advice on who to judge. Maybe instead of their brethren. I hope that stepping away from that would bring some peace. I'm not trying to be antagonistic for antagonistic's sake. I'm trying to suggest that the world is trying to grab hold of the hands of Christians with language that we're sympathetic to and lead us down the devil's path. It's an old trick. I remember talking to my grandfather about these things. And like so many times, I would say, Papa, you're not going to believe what I just read today. And I would give him a quote. And he'd say, son, we've been through this before. And things got heated then too. And a lot of brethren got caught up. A lot of brethren fighting against it, went too far in the other direction. But we made it through it because we just stuck right here. We didn't get down in the trenches and engage and start a pot shot war, and that's not what I want to do. I'm not suggesting go on social media and fight back against all this. In fact, if anything, just step away. Zero in your focus to what you've got available to accomplish and work on that. That should be a comfort. And the other comfort that it'll bring is you can actually accomplish some good. And stop feeling so helpless like there's no good that you can do. There's a lot of good you can do, but it's right here. Would you like to participate in that? To become a part of that? We're not going on a crusade, except right here. But it'll be rewarding. And it'll be eternally rewarding. Even though the world will say, you're not getting much done. God will see what you're getting done. And his calculus is not the same as the world's. If we could invite you to be a participant in that, we'd rejoice if we could help you in any way we can. If you'll come while we stand and while